You're listening to the Converging Paths podcast, brought to you by Asia House and the Barakat Trust, with the support of the Al Tajir Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture.
Hello, this is your host, Juan de Lara. I hope that all of you are having a well-deserved summer break. As every month, we're bringing you some exciting content to accompany you during this time. And today we have a very exciting theme, as we have here with us Alain George. Alain is the IMP Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at Oxford University. Alain has just published a new book titled The Great Mosque of Damascus, Art, Faith and Empire in Early Islam. This has been published by our friends from Jinko. Alain is here to tell us more about his book and to unveil the marvelous history that hides behind its construction at a time in history was extremely tumultuous but extremely fascinating. Thank you so much for being with us today, Alain. I think my first question for you, which I think will be useful for the audience that is not familiar with this building, is what is the Mosque of Damascus? And why is it an important monument for art history?
Thank you, Juan, and thank you for having me on your series. The Mosque of Damascus is a monument which was founded at the very end of the 1st century of Islam, in the early 8th century. And so it's important on several counts. First, because it's the earliest major mosque that's still standing in something close to its original state. And so it's a very important historical document, if you like, about early Islam. And it also has very well preserved wall mosaics from this period, which are rare. And it's important because this has been a major cultic site since high antiquity, at least since the 9th century BC. And when you look at the mosque and the history of the site, you find traces not just of the Umayyad period when it was built, but also of previous periods like the Roman period especially, and of every subsequent period in the history of Damascus. So it contains, in a way, the whole history of this city.
Thank you, Alain. And I guess the topic takes us directly to your book. And I wanted to know, why this book now?
Up until now, we had some very good studies on the Mosque of Damascus, especially in the last 60 years on the mosaics and attempts to interpret these mosaics, which have vast landscapes with trees and buildings and rivers. But what I found was missing was a simple historical narrative of the reason why this extraordinary monument was founded. And I also found that there was more historical evidence than you would expect for this period, 13 centuries ago. So we have very important literary evidence in the form of poems. We have administrative papyri that date from the period and are related to it. And we have very good medieval Syrian Arabic sources that contain a lot of information about it. So it's a monument about which we have a wealth of information, which is a bit difficult to digest because it's done for different purposes, but it's there. And that's allowed me to reconstruct the historical sequence of events that led to the existence of this building.
And in terms of the building, it would be useful for the audience to understand why, when, and by whom was it constructed. Why was a mosque decided to be built at the end of the 8th century in this city, in Damascus?
That's a very good question. So the Prophet Muhammad dies in 632, and this is a period of expansion for Muslim armies, and they reach Damascus in the 630s. And we know that they build a first mosque there, which is probably a very simple building. But this site, most of all, was the site of a Roman temple of Jupiter, one of these gigantic temples that the Romans built, like the temple of Baalbek in Lebanon, not very far from Damascus, or the temple of Bel in Palmyra. And then it becomes a Christian site in the 4th century. And so the first mosque of Damascus in the 7th century stands next to a church. And this church may have been a conversion of the Roman temple. And at first, this isn't a problem because most Muslim cities, especially in Greater Syria, tend to have this combination of a mosque and a church at the heart of the urban fabric. What makes Damascus different eventually is the fact that it becomes the capital of the Muslim Empire in the 660s. And so all of a sudden we have this situation whereby the caliphs, the rulers of this empire, which becomes the largest that the world has ever seen during those years, have their main palace abutting a site of which the key building is the church. And of course, they're proclaiming this new form of monotheism, Islam, at the time. And this becomes more and more of a political problem for them in the 7th century. So we hear from the sources that two caliphs called Muawiyah and Abd al-Malik try to buy the church from the Christians of Damascus, but they refuse. And in 705, we have a young caliph who's called Al-Walid, who's the son of the previous one, who really cuts the Gordian knot, or maybe does something reckless by, in the perspective of his contemporaries, which is to take the church by force, and then he gives some compensation to the Christians. And this really runs against the social order of early Islam. It's a very bold and provocative gesture, which sends ripples beyond Damascus at the time. But it allows him to reclaim this site entirely for Muslims. And ultimately, he's been very successful.
So it seems to me that this character you were talking about, Al-Walid, appears in a time that was quite turbulent in the Middle East. Nonetheless, he appears as a powerful leader, but young. What can you tell us about his personality and his way to deal with the new religion and the community?
So it's very hard to pin down personalities at such a remove of centuries and centuries, but we get the sense that Al-Walid is impulsive. He's a young leader who had been prepared to become caliph by his father, but he wasn't next in line until a few weeks before he became caliph. And so all of a sudden, here he is. He's the caliph of the largest empire in the world. And he makes this very bold move. The sources tell us, but they're late sources and we don't know if it's true or not, just to give you a picture, that he was tall, he had a brown complexion, he had suffered from smallpox and he had a few traces of it on his body, and that he had a beard with just a little bit of gray hair on it, and all the rest of his hair was black. Some sources say that he was ugly and that he used to strut. God only knows. And so, but we have this ruler who is coming into a context which is less turbulent than it's been in previous decades. Why? Because there was a civil war between Muslims. There were several actually, but there was a very recent one, which was won by his father. And so his most dangerous internal opponents were killed. And there was a conflict with Byzantium. And the Umayyads had been forced to pay a huge tribute to Byzantium on a yearly basis until a few years before these events happened. So Al-Walid arrives on the scene in an empire that's managed to remove these threats. And that's also consolidated its rule, which means they've got more taxation, which is taken regularly from the population in particular, and they really tighten their grip on the whole state apparatus and the population. And the Mosque of Damascus is, in one way, the embodiment of all of these changes and of this consolidated dynasty. And it's also the period in which Muslim rulers begin to assert Islam as a religious dogma, much more publicly and clearly than before. There was a very strong policy of consensus building with Christians in previous decades when the empire was still expanding. And now there's both more religious dogma at the forefront. Wait, I'll say that again. It's nice. I shouldn't do live interviews, you know.
Nice. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so Al-Walid now has control over taxation, over his territories and his governors much more strongly than any Muslim ruler before him in previous decades. And the Mosque of Damascus becomes an embodiment of all these trends. And it's interesting to note that it's not the only mosque that he builds. During the decade of his reign, he also builds at least 7 other major mosques, none of which survives. There are maybe a few fragments from the Umayyad period here and there. But so he's really using mosque architecture as a way to project dynastic power and religious authority. And you have to remember that the early caliphs of Islam are religious and political leaders at the same time. There's no division there. So it's been called a form of Caesaropapism in that sense. He's both Caesar and the Pope, if we want to translate. And this is also what this mosque and his other mosques are telling the population, which is predominantly Christian at the time.
So you have mentioned before that during this period, and because of the fear to this leader, there was a general consensus to consolidate different powers. But this monument has the characteristic also that at different points in time, it was a pagan temple, a church, and a mosque. And I wonder if you consider this building as an archive that helps us to narrate the interactions at the time between pagans, Christians, and Muslims.
Absolutely, I think you're right about that. I used the concept of the palimpsest to explain this. The palimpsest, it's a literary concept from that's existed since the 19th century. The palimpsest is a manuscript that's been erased, so you lose the text that it was conveying, but actually it's still latent and you can bring it back. And over time, you end up with an artifact which contains many different successive layers, some of which are more erased than others, some of which are preserved in memory and discourse as well. And I think the Mosque of Damascus, any architecture is palimpsestic, really, because the moment you start repairing or you have any damage and any change to the building, you have new layers that are accruing in your building. But this is particularly striking at the Mosque of Damascus, where the oldest preserved artifact is a stone relief from the 9th century BC, showing a sphinx, where the walls of the mosque are the walls of the Roman temple, and all of the columns on which it was built were Roman. And you have traces of every subsequent layer that's existed there. And as you were saying, we have traces of how pagans interacted with Christians, especially in the 4th century, when there was a conflictual relation between the two faiths and oppression of pagan cult by the newly arisen Christian empire. Then we have traces of what happens between Muslims and Christians in the early 8th century, and it continues in every later period. Another illustration of that is the fact that it preserved for centuries a cache of manuscripts, including hundreds of thousands of early Quranic folios, but also many Christian fragments in different languages, so Greek, Latin, but also Syriac, which is a form of Aramaic, Georgian, even Middle French, because this continued into later periods as well. So in many ways, this site is an extraordinary concentrate of the history of this whole region.
That is fascinating. I wonder if while you were doing research on these topics and on the mosque, did you come up with any anecdote that's surprising, funny, or witty surrounding the building and its construction?
Right. When you ask me this, two images come to mind. They're very vivid scenes. They're not necessarily funny, actually, but they're quite striking. One of them is a story preserved in Syrian sources about Al-Walid's takeover of the church. And the sources tell us that he orders his agents in the administration to seize the church from Christians who protest. They absolutely don't want that. And this comes to a standstill when the Christians say that anyone who breaks the church with his tools is going to be damned. The church has sacred powers. So Al-Walid himself, in the stories, comes into the mosque precinct at this point, and he goes into a tower within the mosque, and he finds there a monk, an ascetic, who was refusing to come down. He grabs him by the neck and drives him down the stairs, and then throws him out of the church and mosque precinct. And then he says, "You're afraid, so I'm going to show you how this is done." And he takes a pickaxe, and he's the one who begins to destroy the church himself. And it's a very good story. It just shows you in a very dramatic narrative form this change of ownership of the site and the role that Al-Walid plays in that. And it's tempting for us as historians to regard it as just this, as a narrative. But interestingly, we have poems, court poems written for Al-Walid that survive and that seem to suggest that he did get directly involved in that destruction. So maybe there is a kernel of historical fact which has been embellished, if you like, with this story. And then if I jump ahead a few centuries into the 15th century, so we're under the Mamluk dynasty, which rules from Egypt, there's one of the major fires at that point that destroys the mosque. And we have very striking eyewitness accounts of this fire in 1479 by someone called Ibn al-Himsi. And he just tells us how people were devastated at the site and tried to save what could be saved amongst the precious objects, such as carpets, for instance, that had been accumulated within this space over the years, and how they all wept when the fire stopped and they saw what was left, and they were weeping during congregational prayer. And he also tells us, interestingly, that Christians were also affected, just like the Muslims, by what they saw at that point. And we have some evidence of Christians still participating sometimes in repairs as craftsmen, even then.
It's wonderful to hear more about these finds and these stories that seem to support history that somehow form part of the fantastic history related to famous personalities like Al-Walid. One thing to consider about buildings is that they are a testament of moments in history, particularly in human development. What do you think we can learn from the mosque in Damascus, or what can we learn from a figure like Al-Walid?
That's an interesting question. We can learn first about the genesis of Islamic art, because this is the period in which they're really beginning to sponsor art on a monumental scale. It starts in the 690s, and we're still in the very early stages at that time, 700s. And we have a new architecture that's built as a synthesis of what existed before, which is mosque architecture, which had provided a template of the mosque and its general shape and articulation, and the means provided by Christian church architecture. Because if you're standing in the early 8th century and you want to build the finest building of the day, you have to use Christian craftsmen. They're just the best that you can use. And so this is why you find in the mosque marble paneling with veined marble, what we call quartered marble, which is a bit like waves that you also find in early churches. We have wall mosaics, which were common in churches in late antiquity. But each of these elements and the columns and the arches on which churches were built, each element has been reworked. It's as if you were using the same grammar, but you create a new syntax. You rearrange the elements. And Al-Walid is bringing mosque patronage to a new level. And I think this leaves a major imprint. Just the fact that he spent so much on a major mosque, and then in later decades, people can see the results, can see the lasting impact that it has on collective minds and memories. And I think it provides an important impetus in the history of the mosque. And so, if you like, this mosque is a witness of this Muslim Christian society, which also has a Jewish minority, that is the crucible of early Islam, especially in Syria and Egypt. You're almost touching it, it's there. For me, there's something which is even more fascinating than this, which is that by reading poems composed for Al-Walid and by studying the way that they compose their mosaics as well, these very large mosaic panels, you end up with a sense of the aesthetics which guided the Umayyads. Unstated aesthetic values about how you create beauty. And these values are fundamentally premised on ambiguity, on polysemy. And in that sense, they resemble the world of late antiquity in the Christian sphere, and they kind of disturb our modern expectations about something more one-dimensional with a clear meaning. What I mean by that is that artistic achievement is measured in literature, but also in the visual arts, by the extent to which it can stir emotion in the beholder, but also the extent to which you can't pin it down. So every time you're going to see it, or every time you're going to hear a poem, it's going to be a new experience. You're going to have a new understanding, maybe a new emotional reaction as well to what you see. And these were fundamental values. They're the aesthetic values which underpin the reception of the Quran in early and classical Islam as an open text which has an infinite wealth, an infinite number of meanings, and you can come back to it every day and it's going to be something fresh. And this is exactly what travelers say and writers say about their experience of the ornament of the Great Mosque of Damascus as well. So all of this work together in concert. And you have to imagine that the Quran was recited day and night within the walls of this mosque as well. So it was a very powerful aesthetic experience with sound that was added to sight, and they probably burned incense and fragrances and applied fragrances as well. So it's really meant to call upon all of the senses to create a single unified reaction, but it's a reaction which is never the same as well.
Thank you so much, Alain. Has been a wonderful way to finalize the podcast with a very evocative image of the mosque. We very often tend to forget the sensorial aspects of the buildings, and I think through this podcast you can get more information on not only the aesthetics and how it looked like, but also what it felt to be part of it. Really appreciate you sharing your time with us today, and I hope that hopefully at some point in the future you're able to come back to London and join us for an in-live session or event here at Asia House.
Thank you very much, and it will be my pleasure to have another discussion. Thank you, Juan.